Hello, in this video, I want to continue the conversation that we've been having about Afro-Pessimism and space privatization. I really enjoyed doing this series so far because I think that it's really important to have an understanding of why Afro-Pessimism is a central criticism for this resolution and why it can be distinct from some of the other conversations that we've had about racial capitalism and settler colonialism, even if it kind of falls along or follows a lot of the core ideas that are kind of necessary from those criticisms that we talked about in the other lectures and isn't really necessary for you to watch in order for you to have background context for the stuff that we'll be talking about here. In this particular video, I do think that it would be important for you to watch the last video that I did in the intro to Afro-Pessimism in space, because in this video, we're going to continue the conversation that we were having about Afro-Pessimism as a negative strategy versus policy teams. And in the last video and in the intro, we kind of start talking about like what are the priorities and main ideas that make Afro-Pessimism so good on the space privatization topic. What should your objective and priorities be, and where should you kind of be like setting up some of the kind of like top level meta function of the debate so that you can have a better time understanding a lot of the stuff that I'll be talking about this video when we start talking about links, perms, impact comparison, and alternative debating, all of which I think is really important to get a full grasp on how this criticism really works against policy teams. And I definitely think that in a lot of cases you would be helpful in terms of being able to kind of like follow along this context regardless of whether or not you're looking to read this criticism or find ways to answer it, because I think that either way, just getting more information on the functionings or central portions that kind of like make this critique work and the wheels turn, especially in the context of space privatization, can help you maybe spur some ideas for ways that you want to extend it or answer it in the context of the debates that you'll be having. And so hopefully the series as a whole is just like really helpful when you kind of like understand the whole thing combined. I think that when we're just kind of considering following from the last video, which you should be doing in the context of the link debate, I think that this is a place where most teams are really going to probably give you the link argument and try to figure out ways that they can beat you on other forces in the debate. But I still think that oftentimes we're reading Afro-Pessimism, things like link diversification and specific kind of like resolution-based criticisms for like arguments can be a really hard places to find and like really build evidence into. And so I kind of definitely want to talk about like some ideas for like what link arguments could look like. The first thing is that I think that we should never kind of like separate the conversation that we're having with space about the conversation of science and technology, which is where we kind of like ended in the last video when we started talking about the thesis level concerns of the debate. And I definitely think that it needs to reflect in your link arguments. I feel like because of that kind of like extra topical facet of what we've been talking about for a lot of these affirmatives in terms of how they establish other space programs outside of just or other space uses for space outside of just kind of like the idea that space privatization and the status quo is bad, ultimately allows you to make a lot of arguments about why the kind of ascension or creation of new science and technology, ideas like innovation and things like those that people often use to justify systems of capitalism or civil society as it is in order to create a necessary extension of human life, is a really where you kind of want to situate some of your like main offense for why at a symbolic level and at a political level the kind of ethos or political ideas or objective that is kind of behind the kind of functioning of science and technology as it relates to the affirmative is basically to secure the ability for one particular kind of like nation or set of people or communities to be able to like hold a kind of like power over science and technology that not only sends a particular type of relationship to like hegemony as it relates to like a broader concept for like militarism and other ideas broadly, but rather how it kind of operates as like a cultural entity that ultimately sees whiteness, science, and the kind of like white humanity as a particular demand of like what's necessary in order to create progress, and why this secures a type of like way in which we live human life only to continue human life, which doesn't allow us to kind of like stop and ask the question of like what is the moment where something becomes too unethical for us to allow it to continue, or what are the sacrifices that we should be willing to make in order to ensure that life isn't being lived along lines that like require the continued like slavery and marginalization of particular types of populations. I then think that as you kind of like continue, a lot of the other arguments that you can make on the link level are about why the kind of like vertical mobility of what's really offered in space like is ultimately kind of like the kind of ascension that ultimately allows for like spatialization to continue in ways that it does on Earth. I think there are a lot of arguments to be made about like how like space gentrification as like a particular concept means that like public use is about like a particular commons that is accepted for like what the citizen subject looks like in that particular nation state, and the idea that blackness is able to have proper representation along who would get access to space or the commons that are offered by it is one that doesn't like necessarily understand how the state is already kind of like pre-programmed by its like relationship to slavery to have a particular type of like marginalized relationship to like redistribution, and why that ultimately means that in the context of ascension that the idea of being able to solve these existential threats really only means providing infrastructure for those who can't afford it or those that are like needed for being most protected. And our kind of society on Earth is already sectioned in such a way that like certain communities don't have the infrastructure for there to just be like some mass turnaround outside of the context of, for instance, what the facets of the plan are. And so I feel like there are a lot of arguments to be made about like why the kind of like protection that is being provided is only that which does so in terms of protecting humanity broadly to continue systems of violence and suffering rather to do anything generative about them. I then think that when you move on to places like the permutation, this is where you really need to settle down and make a lot of arguments about like the mutual exclusivity between being able to think space while also being able to understand pessimism and the grasp that it has on our relationship to history and our relationship to slavery as a whole. I think making pertinent arguments about how the kind of like net benefits that would be made from a permutation still require the idea that like being able to invest in space at any capacity is good. And I think that as long as you're impact turning that idea, then you should be able to kind of like set up clear lines where the other team isn't really able to kind of like match you in terms of being able to actually win, that the strategies are comparable, because there's no world in which doing the affirmative is a good idea. It's just a question of why refusing it is like net better or more ethical in the context of some of your other framing devices, which is why I think it's more important to kind of like talk about like why impact comparison is so central, because I think that this is another place where if you're able to build nuanced offense kind of like in the link debate and in the kind of the top level function of the debate, it's something that can provide another source of offense from you that also shows like the net benefits to how your alternative is processing thinking about violence. Because I think some of the better alternatives on this topic are like the kind of like analytical frame ones that are really about just refusing the kind of like way in which the 1AC is thinking about the role that state power and other kind of like forces serve or function as. I think that in the context of like what you should be doing on impact comparison, the most important thing I think you can do is connected to some of the framing questions that you've made above. You've already kind of like indicted the idea of futurity at the level of fiat and what it does for our particular relationship to space as like a resolution. And so now it's a question of how can you take that idea of futurity and take it outside the context of fiat and make it more about the idea of life evaluation, or how we think about like the idea of just impact comparison as a whole. This isn't just like an indictment of utilitarianism, but it is an indictment of the way in which like risk calculus is used in order to create and assign futural amounts to particular lives in order to justify what type of action is like good or bad. And I think that a lot of the arguments you make about like why that type of risk analysis allows for the kind of like sacrificial logic of being able to continue to create like sources of marginalization or like allow anti-blackness to continue, because the way it's so attached to the status quo that the logic of things, for instance, like getting worse or the world getting worse is not about the way in which it gets worse for particular type of populations, but how the standard of living as a whole drop, which means as long as there are like protected populations in the context of like white folk, or the ability for particular populations to remain protected under the veil of humanity as a whole, then there is no reason to change the standard for how we're able to think about like the relationship or the conditions of folks that experience like the worst of these kind of like realities. And so I think being able to push those is a reason why these kind of like futural notions of risk analysis only secure and make anti-blackness like possible and justifiable no matter like the ends or means is a really good way for you to kind of like start attacking the impact comparison and use it as a place to like prove why the shift in paradigm for what your alternative would do in order to understand violence as this kind of like historical way of accruing like various impacts and different forms of suffering into like how we're able to understand and relate to the present as a net better way for how we're able to like analyze what types of like ways we should address these particular forces of violence and shift the way in which our kind of like tactics and political action show up otherwise, which are much more generative ways for you to kind of like use the offense that you have at the top level of the criticism in the other context of the debate, and in the context of like making the alternative make a lot more sense without having to use a whole bunch of time on it. And so hopefully this video is helpful for you, and you'll tune into more videos I'll be doing with just debate, space privatization, and all types of things. And yeah, thank you as always for tuning in.